Hi, this is Harish here. Welcome to DB2 LUW tips and tricks video tutorial part 7. In this video tutorial I'm going to talk about security routines and administration views for listing authorities, privileges and ownerships. These are built-in routines and administration views. Before getting into the routines, there is a word that I am talking about: create database without restrictive option. So the restrictive is a keyword when you create the database. If you do not give the restrictive option, like a default public group will be assigned, will be given the authorities: create tab, bind add, connect, implicit schema, select on system catalog. This is actually very important because from a security standpoint, if somebody has select privilege on the system catalogs, they can view your metadata, they can view what are all the tables you have in the system, they can view what are all the stored procedures, and if some business logics and all is there in the stored procedure, what you are using it. So everything will be accessible to some user who is like public. Like any OS level user is generally treated as a public user. So it's always better to use, from a security standpoint, the restrictive keyword. The routines that we are going to talk about is sysproc.auth get instance auth id. This particular routine is useful for getting who is the instance owner kind of information, and auth list authorities for auth id. This is one routine that is going to list all the authorities that are held for an authentication id. Now it will take two arguments: auth id and auth type. So auth id is like your username. Auth type is the type. Like if it is a user, you have to say the user name as the auth id, and U, the alphabet U, uppercase, you have to pass it for auth id type. Similarly, you can list the authorities for a group as well, because the authorities can be granted to the group as well, in which case you will have to pass group name as your authentication id, and uppercase alphabet G for your authentication id type. And for roles also, you can pass the role name and capital R for authentication id type. And for public is treated like a special group, so authentication id would be uppercase public, and authentication id type would be G. Now the third routine, sysproc.auth list groups for auth id, takes a input of authentication id. It will list what are all the groups that a particular user is part of. Like you can get this information from the OS level as well. Like normally this user 1, user 2 who is part of some group 1, and another user 3 and user 4 is part of group 4. So that is more like a OS level users and groups concept. So you can also get what is defined in the DB2 system as well. And sysproc.auth list roles for auth id. So this will list for a given user or group or role what are all the roles that particular authentication id holds. So you can grant roles to individual users, you can grant roles to public, you can grant roles to group also. So that's why this routine is very helpful to find out what are all the roles that are granted to a particular individual user or group or public or role. Like a role itself can be granted to another role. That is called as nesting of roles or role hierarchy. And some of the administration views we are going to look at it is SYSIBMADM.AUTHORIZATIONIDS, which will list for all the who are all can access the system, like who are all valid users of the system. It will show the authorization IDs. SYSIBMADM.PRIVILEGES, it will give you the who are all holding the privileges on database objects, like select privilege on a table or execute privilege on a stored procedure, like that. And SYSIBMADM.OBJECTOWNERS is for ownership of the database objects, like who is owning the database object. Like say who is owning the table, like if a user creates the table, he becomes the owner of the table, so it will give that ownership information. So we'll quickly go to the examples. Okay. So here, so this is the thing, create database. I have already run the script and I have collected the output here, so we are just going to go through that. So create database test restrictive. This was the restrictive keyword that I am talking about. Now I can also have like a non-restrictive database. I am just giving you for comparison. See, here I am saying create DB my test. This is a non-restrictive database. So if you look at the SYSIBMADM.AUTHORIZATION IDs in a non-restrictive database, you will find that the public user, public group, okay, so public is the authentication ID, the auth ID type is G, group, and ABC, he is the one who created the database, and he is a user. So both of them are available, and these two are some system created roles which are used by the system internally, DB2 system internally. We didn't create it. Okay, so public is granted access, and ABC is also granted some authorization on the database if you do not use a restrictive keyword. So if it is in test.out, like say in the restrictive database, when I am running the authorization IDs, I am finding only ABC. So obviously ABC will be allowed. He is the owner, like he is the one who created the database here. So he will have access. And to be more precise, actually, I am querying the catalog table syscat.dbauth. Okay. So here you can find there is only one record ABC who is given DBADM authority and also data access and access control authority. Whereas in a non-restrictive database like my test, right? So look at the dbauth, like the syscat.dbauth. So for that there are two records, so ABC and also public. So ABC is a user, public is a group, and since this public group, they are granted bind add authority, connect authority, create tab authority. So what will happen is, like if you look down here, I am doing the connect reset. I can connect to my test using some user org, okay, who is there in the system. So the connect authority, I will be able to connect, so this as org user, and I will be able to create table also, right? So that is the repercussion. So even some OS level user can connect to the database and create tables. Not only create tables, he can all these bind add, all those implicit authorities are there, right? So bind add is there, connect is there, create tab is there, implicit schema is there. So he can create schema objects as well. Okay. So whereas if you look in the test, which is a restrictive database, you will find that if I try to connect to test using org, it will say I do not have the connect privilege. It won't allow such connections because public group is not at all having any authority whatsoever. See here, public authority is not there. Okay. And let's look at the so this is for the restrictive and non-restrictive database. So I'll close the mytest.out. Okay. Now let's look at how we can use this routine. Okay. We want to find out how we can use this routine. The routine that we are trying to discuss here is list authorities for auth ID. Okay. Now it takes two arguments. You can call it for like public G, so which is like I am calling for the public group what are all the authorities that public group has. I can call it by using this way also, and I can pass individual usernames also. So ABC is a user, so I am passing it like U. Okay, like that I can do. Okay. Now and we will find that there are multiple columns here. So D means direct access, like if a particular authority was granted directly to the user, or it is directly granted to a group, or directly granted to public, so then it will show in these columns. And if it is directly granted to a role, okay, and role underscore user, role underscore group, role underscore public are something like indirect way of getting an authority. So if a particular user as part of association, like he is granted some role and that role is having an authority, granted an authority, then it will show under role underscore user. Same applies to group. So if for a particular group, that group is granted a particular role and that role is having an authority, then it will show here. And public, if a particular role is granted to public, okay, and by virtue of that particular authority is there, then it will show in these columns. So we'll just look in a detailed way. Okay. So first I am connecting to test. Okay. So the connection is done with ABC, and I am listing the authorities for user u1. Okay, this is for user u1 I am just listing the authorities. Okay, so you can find that everything is no here because he doesn't have any authority as of now. It's a restricted database, so any user cannot just they will not even have any access, any type of access, authority or privileges, anything. So everything is no here. Okay, now what I am doing is I am doing grant access control on database to user u1. So this is like a D user, like this is like direct authority is granted directly to the user. Okay, so now I'll execute the routine list authorities for auth ID for user u1. So you'll find that the access control is granted. You will see a Y here. It is under D_user column because it was granted to him directly. Nothing else is there. Everything is N. Okay, so that is the column D_user. Okay, now look at here. I am granting bind_add authority on the database to group G1. So here an authority is granted to a group, not to an individual user. Okay, it's to a group. So who are part of that group G1, they will get the access. They will get the authority bind_add. Now u1 is actually set up in the OS in such a way that it's part of G1. So I am getting the authorities for u1. Okay, look at here, the bind_add authority is showing here. See, the bind_add authorities is showing under D group. So this user is part of a group G1, and for that group G1 the authority has been granted in a direct way. That's why it is showing in here. And access control is granted to the user u1 directly. So that's why it's showing there. Okay, and next what I am doing is I am trying to list the authorities for the group itself. Like I am passing G as the group, G as the authentication ID type, and G1 as the group name. So that group actually we have granted only one access, which is the bind_add authority. So only that will be shown, nothing else will be available here. Okay, so you can list the authorities for an individual user. You can also list the authorities for the group. So if the group has that authority, it will show appropriately, and in our case it is granted directly, so it is showing under D_group. Next I am creating a role R1, and I am granting connect authority to role R1, and I am granting the role to user u1. Now the user u1 is kind of inheriting the authority connect because of he is granted role R1. So then what happens is in which column you will get the answer, right? So list authorities for user I am again running. Look at here, the important column to note is role_user. See here, the connect authority is given under role_user. Okay, so because that particular user did not get the authority directly, he was not granted connect authority directly, so it will not show under D_user. User u1 belongs to group G1, but that group was not directly given the authority. User u1 was granted a role R1, so it will be under, so that this particular user, because of a role that he is granted and that role has the authority, he is getting that connect authority. So that is how it works. So role_user is where you will find this. Okay, now the next thing I am doing is I am granting explain authority on database to public itself. Okay, the public group, right? So I am granting that is successful, and I am listing again the authorities that will be held by user u1. So since this explain authority is given to public, it will be coming, and it is a direct access, right? So D_public will have the explain authority here, right? And it is for that particular user actually, right? So if you look at here, we are just querying the list authorities for user, but any user will be treated as part of public only, so he'll inherit that authority as well. So user u1 is having explain authority in an indirect way, but it is granted to public in a direct way. See, that's why it is D_public. From a user's perspective, it is an indirect way that he is getting the authority because of the public thing. Okay, because of the public association, the authority is granted to public directly. Okay, and for the public group I am just again listing the authorities now. So you will find that it is having the explain authority because it is directly granted to public. Okay, now I am creating role R2 and I am granting it to group G2, and the data access authority I am granting it to role R2. So the data access authority is actually given to role R2, but the role R2 is actually granted to G2 as well. So the group G2 gets that particular data access authority in an indirect way because of the role participation. That's why you will see that in role underscore group. Okay, so if you run the list authorities for the user U1, see again here I am running the authorities command for user U1 because user U1 is part of G2 also. Okay, so what happens is data access authority, look at the column it shows here, role underscore group. See, because that particular user is part of a group G2 and that particular group G2 was not given a direct access, but it was through the role participation, through the role that particular group was granted. Because of that it got the data access authority, right? So this user will have the data access authority because of his participation in the group G2, and it was granted to that group in an indirect way because of the role involved in it. So if you look at the G1 was granted directly, the bind add authority was granted directly to G1, so that's why it is showing in the D underscore group column. Okay, and you can grant role to public also. So create role R3, grant the role R3 to public, and grant an authority SQLADM to role R3, correct? So this is like will be reflected in the column role underscore public. So SQLADM, if you look at that, see here, it will be reflecting under role underscore public, because any user will be like I am listing the authorities for user U1 only. Okay, but any user is part of that public group, so he will get the SQLADM authority as well. Okay, so now if you look at the user U1, he got this access directly, access control authority directly, that's the D underscore user. Bind add authority was granted to him because of his group association, and that is the G1. Okay, and for that group the authority was granted directly. And connect is because this particular user is part of a role R1 and he got this authority. Data access is he's part of a group G2 and G2 was actually granted role R2 and R2 is having that authority, that's why he is inheriting this as well. Okay, and explain authority is like any user is kind of part of public, so the public was granted explain authority directly, so this user is inheriting that as well. And SQLADM, just now we saw that. So this user is part of public and public got granted a role R3, and because of that it gets this authority as well. Okay, and you can also use to find out now what are all the authorities that the public holds. Now the public should hold two authorities. One is explain authority, which was granted to the public directly, and SQLADM is the authority which was granted to the public by means of a role R3. So that is also reflecting. Okay, so it's a bit kind of complex to understand and confusing, but once you know this particular clear difference, segregation between these D columns and role columns, it will be very easy to understand. Okay, now when this D underscore role will be populated, so I am just listing the authorities for a role. So I can list the authorities for user, I can list the authorities for group, I can list the authorities for public, I can also list the authorities for a role actually. So for R1 I am passing R, so you will find that R1 is having connect authority and it was a direct grant. Data access was given to role R2, and for role R3 SQLADM is given. Okay, now we will look about nesting of roles or role hierarchy. So I am creating a role R4, I am creating a role R5, and I am granting load authority to role R4. I am granting WLAM ADM authority to role R5, and I am granting role R4 to R5, which means R5 contains the role R4 as well. Okay, so now look at what happens. So I am listing the authorities for R5 here, right? So if I list the authorities for R5, you will find that load authority is also there, WLMADM authority is also there for R5. Like if I list the authorities for R4, like say for R4 role I am listing the authorities, it will have only load ADM, sorry load, okay, load authority. It will not have WLMADM, but R5 will inherit both the things because R5 is containing R4 as well. Okay, so load is also there. So this is the nesting of roles, and I am granting the role to individual user U2. Okay, so after that I am looking at the U2 users authorities. Okay, so if you look at here, he gets the explain authority because any user is part of a public, and public was granted directly explain authority. And he gets the load authority because he is part of R4. Like we actually granted only R5, and R5 in turn is part of R4, so the authority, load authority will also come here, and WLADM authority also will come to him. And look at here, SQL ADM also will come to him because any user is part of public, and public is granted role R3, and R3 is holding SQL ADM authority. So look how this chain works actually. So that's more important, and that's more brought about in a clear fashion also through these routines. Okay, next I am looking at the DB auth table. So what are all the authorities? So so it will only give direct authorities. Like say if a person or user, we are granting the authorities directly, right? So only those are mentioned here. Like say G2 is group G2 is having authorities. It is not reflecting here. User U2 is getting authorities. That is not reflecting here because they are getting the authority in an indirect way, either because of participation through the public or either because of participation through some other roles. Okay, so that is one thing. And the next thing is auth get instance auth ID. So it will give you the instance owner. In our case it is DB2 inst1. And you can also list the groups. Say U1 is part of G1 and G2. So you can use OS level commands also to find the user group associations. It is also what is there defined in the DB2 system also. We can use this, but it's not generally advised because always your OS level or LDAP or some security plugin is going to give you this user group associations. It's better to look at that point actually. Okay. So for U2 actually it says there is nothing. The public group and all will not show here. Public is like a default group. It's not shown here and all. Okay. And the next thing is auth list roles for auth ID. See, for this particular user, what are all the roles? So if you look at user U1, he is granted R1, R2, R3. See, he is granted R1 directly. See here, this will tell you like the user U1 got this role R1 in a direct way, and because of his participation with group G2, and G2 is granted R2, that's why that particular user got the role R2 also. It's an indirect way of procuring that role. And public, so this user is part of public also, so public was granted role R3, so that is also shown here. So the user U1 will have R1, R2, R3, and for the user U2, okay, so for the user U2, R3, R4, R5 all are applicable, all roles are applicable. So because for that user, any user is part of public, so he inherits the role R3 also, and we granted the user U2 R5, right? For user U2 we granted R5, but R5 in turn is actually containing R4, so that is also shown here. So R3, R4, R5. Okay, and the next routine is auth list roles for auth ID. So for this particular group G1, what are all the roles? I can use this method also, auth list roles for auth ID. For this particular group, what are all the roles? We did not grant any roles to G1, so it's not there. But we remember for G2 group we have assigned a role R2, correct? We granted a role R2, so that is shown here, right? Similarly for public we granted R3, that is also shown here. Okay, and the next thing is for role also I can find out. See, this is the most interesting part here. See, for the role R4 I am trying to find out what roles that intern possesses. So this is that nesting. So R4 doesn't possess any role, so 0 records, but R5 is possessing R4. See here, when I call auth list roles for auth ID, R5 is possessing R4, so that is also shown. And if you look at the authorization IDs, so it will say all the users who are having access to the system: G1, G2 group, public group, R1, R2, R3, R4, R5 roles, and system created roles, internal roles, ABC as a user, U1 as a user, U2 as a user. Okay, now we'll get into, so this is more all about authorities. We'll get into privileges. So I am creating a table and I am granting select privilege on that particular table to user U2. I am doing the same thing for user A3, and the user A3 is not at all in the system as well. Okay, U1 and U2 are at least part of their in the OS. A3 is not at all in the system. It need not be. For executing grant, it will go through. You can create the user at a later point of time also. SYSIBMADM.PRIVILEGES, it contains all these columns, so it will give you for a particular authentication ID and a particular authentication type what privilege he is holding, and whether he can grant that privilege in turn to another user or not. That is the grantable column. What object name, what object schema, object type. Object type is like table, view, stored procedure, etc. So if you look at for our this thing, I have querying the privileges table for my tab, the table that we created. So you will see here the user U2 and A3 are having select privileges on that particular table, my tab, which is on the schema ABC, and they cannot grant this select privilege to any other user. And ABC user will hold all other privileges and he can grant them as well, except for the control privilege. Okay, so this is the privileges table, and you can see in the authorization IDs it is now displaying A3 as well, because he is granted some privilege, right? So it is showing that as well. Okay, and the next thing is ownership. So SYSIBMADM.OBJECTOWNERS. So I am just looking for object name my tab, who is owning that. So ABC is the user who created the table, so he is the owner of the table. So it shows what's the table, so it will show everything. So here I am just querying, restricting myself to object name my tab. I can query for stored procedures, I can query for views based on ID also, like say what are all the objects that are owned by ABC, I can query that way. So it's completely flexible, it's useful, okay, for finding out the ownerships. So this is all about authorities, privileges and ownerships, and these routines are extremely useful once you understand them. Okay, pretty much that's it for this video tutorial. Thank you for watching this video, and thank you for subscribing to my channel DB2 LUW Academy. And if you are viewing this video for the first time, please subscribe to my channel DB2 LUW Academy in YouTube. Thank you all. See you in the next video. Bye bye.